Hello, and welcome to the December edition of the Diane Rehm Book Club. I'm Leslie Van Zandt, Chief Advancement Officer at WAMU. At WAMU, our mission is to connect our listeners with each other and the world, to enlighten and broaden perspectives and inspire curiosity. Today at the book club, we bring you a conversation that we hope helps you say goodbye to 2023 and hello to the new year. It was pre-recorded, so there will be no audience questions. Like everything we do at WAMU, the Diane Rehm Book Club would not be possible without your support. If you enjoyed today's conversation or have enjoyed the book club across the year, please consider making a gift by visiting dianerehm.org/give. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Diane Rehm.
Hello and welcome to the December meeting of the Diane Rehm Book Club. Today, a conversation with Mariann Edgar Budde, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington and my faith leader. She joined me earlier to talk about her recent book titled How We Learn to Be Brave. In it, Bishop Budde explores the decisive moments in life when we're called to push past our fears and act with strength, using examples from her own life, from literature, the gospel, and the lives of others. She writes that being brave is not a singular occurrence. It's a journey we can choose to undertake every day. I believe it's a perfect message to share as we say goodbye to one year and welcome in the next. Bishop Mariann, you quote from one of my very favorite hymns at the start of your book. Just a couple of lines. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the facing of this hour, by Harry Emerson Glasdick. Tell me how those words reached out to you on June 1st, 2020.
Well, first of all, Diane, let me tell you, I'm so honored to be in conversation with you. And I would say on June 1st, 2020, in all candor, I didn't have a lot of time to think. It was a moment of response to a crisis in which, and I think all of us can relate to this, in which something adrenaline-like or beyond thought takes over, and I simply had to respond. And so the thoughts of prayer, asking for grace and courage were certainly there, but not foremost in my mind. It was...
Remind us of what happened on that day.
Thank you. June 1st was about 5 or 6 days after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And from the killing forward, there was as you recall, an extraordinary response on the part of the American people all across the country. People pouring into streets peacefully, for the most part, protesting the killing of an innocent man by police officers under the foot of one of them. And our former president had, as was his custom, sadly, not used his power and authority to bring calm to the situation, but actually amplified the tension and threatened to bring down the forces of the U.S. military, if necessary, to quell the human response in American cities across the country. which was chilling. And he said that from a Rose Garden speech, as well as in a call with mayors and governors across the country. And on that day, June 1st, he was speaking in the Rose Garden, and then seemingly without plan or certainly warning to the people who had been gathered in a large assembly outside of the White House in Lafayette Park, there was an order given to forcibly clear the park about 45 minutes to an hour before the curfew, so that he could walk accompanied by his entourage of military and security forces to walk over to St. John's Church, which also has a park or a lovely gathering space outside, which was also filled with people, also forcibly cleared with tear gas, with police force. And then the president stood in front of the church with all of the cameras facing him, holding a Bible. And then he said, "This is a great country." And without saying another word, he left and returned to the White House. And to my eyes, and I was hearing about this as I was sitting where I am now in my home, it seemed to me that he had taken upon himself the spiritual mantle of spiritual authority, using our sacred texts, using the backdrop of a church in the Diocese of Washington to lend further authority to his actions.
In other words, when he got to St. John's, he held up
The Bible.
a copy of the Bible.
Yes.
Upside down.
Apparently, I can't testify to that, but it does. He certainly didn't read from the Bible, and he certainly did not quote the teachings of Jesus, and he did not speak to anyone in the church or me to say that this is what he's doing. So there was we had no warning. And it's not uncommon for St. John's to be a place where a president would come because it's the church closest to the White House. But there was always warning. And Diane, if he had come with our warning, and if he had said that he was going to speak to the nation and offer a word of calm or of consolation, we would have welcomed him with open arms. So that wasn't the issue. The issue was him usurping our platform, our spiritual platform, and taking the Bible as if to say, I am acting with the spiritual mantle as well as the political one to do what I'm doing and to say what I'm saying. And that's where I felt he had crossed a line. And not only me, Diane, because when this was happening, my phone was ringing and buzzing off the hook as people.
While you were at home.
Well, I was at home. I was sitting with my mother, whom I had just moved into our home because of the COVID crisis, and we were watching the news. And so this was all happening in real time. And as I was talking to people and trying to determine how to respond, one of the people that I speak to for counsel said, it's really important that the people of this country hear from you before the sun goes down tonight. And I thought, he's right. And between him and the fact that I know the religious editor of the Washington Post enough to know that I could call her, I just tried as quickly as I could to find some way to disassociate the Episcopal Church from the actions of the president. That was really all I was attempting to do, was to say, he does not speak for us. We stand with the peaceful protesters who are responding to the horrendous killing of George Floyd. And we do not endorse, nor can we allow the president to use us as a platform to further his authority at a time when he is acting in a way that is making the situation that was already fraught even more painful. So grant us strength, grant us courage. There was a sense, and I think that's why I wrote the book, Diane. There was this sense that I was being very brave in that moment, but in all actuality, I felt more like I was standing alongside people who were being much more brave, and that courage wasn't something that can be measured by the ability, however brief, to stand in front of a microphone or a camera, but rather the small and significant lifetime of choices that we make that are moments of courage. And so that's what I wanted people to focus on. As grateful as I was to be there at that time, the larger acts of courage were happening elsewhere, and I wanted to be in support of them.
So you went there?
Yes, yes, I did. Not then at that day, but I went. There was this very poignant movement of other clergy from around the area who wanted to express their support as well. And so there was a fair amount of pressure for us to organize some kind of press conference or something so that more religious leaders could gather and say something similar. And so I and my very small staff agreed. And what the next day or the day after, we went down again to Lafayette Square, and the place was just packed still with young people, mostly young people. And the cameras and the television crews from Lord knows where were just gathered around. They had created, we couldn't get to the church because it had been cordoned off. So they set up this sort of makeshift podium for the religious leaders to speak, with all these lights and microphones and cameras. And we were surrounded by this sea of people. And one by one, religious leaders spoke. And then when I got up to speak, I couldn't see a thing except for the cameras and the lights. And I heard this young man say, "Sit down and shut up." And I realized that this media event had totally displaced people who had been bearing the heat of the sun and sitting all day in protest. And I didn't know what to do. I felt ashamed, actually. And so I did. I just went and I sat down. And this young man said to me, we have been here all day long, and no one's paid attention to us. And then you show up, and all the lights and the cameras come. And then you'll speak, and then they'll go, and we'll still be here. Huh. And I thought, I said, and I apologized. I said, "You're right." And I was just sitting there, and and he wouldn't give me the time of day. He was just furious. But then one of the Baptist ministers who had come, and part of that day, he saw me, and he came over, and he had sort of this big booming voice, and he started speaking to the young people, and he was just talking to them and engaging with them. And then he sort of pulled me up off of put me back on my feet, and he said, "Now this sister is trying to do what's right, and I just want you to be aware that she's really, she's with us, and please be respectful to her." And and again, and then this one other young man said, "Don't take it personally. We're just hot and we're tired. It's been a long day." And I just said, "Yeah, it's been more than a day." So anyway, I guess, Diane, to say is that if it's all about lights and cameras, that's not exactly courage. But if it's about a sustained commitment to what is good and right and just, there may be moments like that, but most of them are quieter and invisible and measured not by media attention, but by the kind of change that we can build our lives upon.
I'm sure you had thought about writing this book, How We Learn to Be Brave. earlier. But was that day the point at which you realized you needed to write this book?
It's a little different, but similar. The timing is correct. I was invited to write a book, which was a tremendous honor and something that had never happened to me before. And a literary agent contacted me after the events of June 1st and a few op-ed articles I had written, and simply said, would you consider writing a book? And if so, what would you write about? And I spent I think it was about 8 months, Diane, working with her and her associate. But I knew from the very beginning that what I wanted to write about, and in fact, the subtitle of the book was really the working title for me, Decisive Moments in Life and Faith. And that's what I wanted to write about. I wanted, and something I've been thinking about my entire life, how those moments in life summon us to step into or step out of where we are into a new place, to take on a task or to begin a journey or to accept something that we would give anything to avoid, but for some reason that we cannot explain is ours now, is part of our life. I wanted to write about those moments and also the arc of life that includes those moments, but 1,000 other moments besides, and how they're connected. Do you know? I wanted to write about the people who've inspired me and what I learn about courage and bravery by studying their lives. And of course, we can all point to, if they're famous people, we can point to the big moments. But what's so interesting is how those moments are connected to the arc of their lives. And so we can see ourselves and our moments through the lens of theirs. And because I'm a person of faith, I delve into the scriptures and I live my life by their lights as best I can. And so I wanted also to tell the story of our faith tradition in such a way that people who may or may not be followers or adherents would understand how our faith is part of that same arc, right? And we draw our strength from those same wells. And so the book over time took shape. It also gave me an opportunity to give voice to things I've been reflecting on for many years.
And to that point, as you say, learning to be brave involves a lifetime of learning.
Yeah.
And going back to your own days in junior high school.
Yeah.
When your own family fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of those pivotal moments when you had to decide whether to stay or to go.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little about what happened then?
I can, thank you. And I start the book with that story because it's the memory that always comes to mind when I think about such moments. In part, I think because I was young, I was 17, this was when I was junior in high school, and it was a conscious moment. In other words, I was fully aware of what was happening and what I was doing. The family that I mention is the family of my father and my stepmother, with whom I had gone to live after a very terrible, nasty custody battle that my mother lost when I was much younger. And my father and stepmother's marriage disintegrated. My father, who was not well, I didn't have words to describe clinical depression or alcoholism in those years, but that's what it was. And he informed me that he was leaving. and that he wanted me to come with him. And I knew that that was not a possibility. I also knew that my stepmother, who really had very little affection for me, would not want me to stay with her and my half brother. And but all the spiritual and other authority figures of my life at the time were trying to find ways to help me stay in my world, which I loved. The world of my school, the world of my church, the world of my very close-knit circle of friends. I had become a Christian in those years, and most of my friends were a part of this tight-knit Christian community. The minister of his family invited me to live with them, and I did live with them for a time. I had every reason, both in my own emotional desire and in the affirmation around me, to stay exactly where I was and complete high school. This was in Colorado. But the inner impulse that drove me to a different decision was very clear. And it said to me, I needed to go. And I needed to go back and live with my mother, my birth mother, which meant reconciling with her. And it meant leaving one religious worldview that was very tight-knit and closed in its understanding of what it meant to be a Christian. And the minister of my church was convinced that if I went to live with my mother, I would be vulnerable to a whole host of other spiritual influences that would be dangerous to my soul. And I had this very strong feeling from God, as well as my own sense of self, that he was wrong and that I needed to go across the country and start a new life with the mother I had abandoned so many years before.
And your sister had gone with your mother while you had gone with your father, or had both of you gone?
Oh, yes. Yes, both of us went. And in fact, she was the one, she's older than I am, and I was really the tag along. My sister was the driving energy to move us to Colorado in our early years. And but I didn't want to be left out. I was determined not to be left out of this change. She had left the household by then. Her life kind of took its own trajectory, and she went on quite on her own. So my sister wasn't, when I moved back to New Jersey, my sister wasn't in the picture at all. So I was the one making this move. The heartache for me at the time, and it had a decades-long impact, was that I was leaving my younger brother, my half-brother, and he was 10 years younger than I, and our relationship never recovered from that, really. And I carried that regret with me for all of my life since then.
And how did the relationship with your mother, your birth mother, work out?
Oh, well, that's the reason why this story is so important is I would say that there isn't any part of who I am right now that isn't in some way connected to that decision, one of which is my relationship with my mother, which is now one of the foundational relationships of my life, and who was there for me and who helped me navigate this very, very challenging time. The church that she was a part of was the Episcopal Church, and rather than backslide into sin, I found a spiritual home that there were parts of that worldview, Diane, that I was already quietly rejecting. I would never have rejected it outright because I loved the people so much who had nurtured me in faith. But I knew that the understanding of God that they were presenting was too small. And so I was so grateful to find a church that had a generous and expansive view of God, and had a place for women and all of those things. And so it became it became the new foundation upon which my adult life could be built. And as I said, it was, for me, it was the first time, and it's not the only time, but it's the first time I can remember having the courage to listen to the inner voice when I had plenty of outer voices telling me on some level what I wanted to hear, and the inner voice telling me to, encouraging me to do something harder that wasn't really what I wanted, but that I never doubted was the call. And so I lean on that memory as a touchstone. It's like the archetype that I hold for when I face similar moments. And they're not all to go, so as I write in the very next chapter, sometimes that inner impulse, that decisive call, is the exact opposite, to stay where I am and to go deeper into the life I have, when the outer call or the outer desire might me to pick up and leave. Does that make sense? It's the same experience, the same sense of crisis almost internally, because the inner call is propelling or guiding in a different way. And I wanted,
I understand perfectly.
Yeah.
When you talk about that early church in which you were involved and its differences between that and the Episcopal Church, what do you mean specifically?
Sure. Both are Christian, obviously. Both have a life of following the teachings of Jesus at the center. The difference is in the church where I came to faith, where I made a confession of faith, the understanding of boundaries between what it meant to be a follower of Jesus and what it meant to be the recipient of grace and salvation was very limited. In other words, we were on the correct path, and the way we were following Jesus was the correct path. But anyone who veered from that, even if they called themselves Christian, were suspect. And so it was a narrow view.
Specifically, homosexuality, abortion, intermarriage, black and white. I mean, are those the things you're talking about?
It would certainly be things I'd be talking about now, but at age 17, none of those things were on my horizon. It was far more, if you believe exactly as we believe, you are saved. In other words, you are saved, your eternal soul is saved, and you are walking on the correct path. If you have any other experience, if you have a born-again experience the way we have a born-again experience, that is your validation. And so I went up to the altar, I professed my faith in Christ. The internal struggle I had within that world was that I never felt like I had the experience exactly the way I was supposed to. But I was in. I wanted it. I felt something. I just never felt as completely saved as I was supposed to feel. And so internally, like every time there was an altar call, I kept on thinking, man, should I go back up? Because I'm not sure it took. And but I never talked about that. I just sort of held that in my heart. And so there was this sense of like, here's the experience, we have it, others don't. And our job now is to pray for them so that they do. It's a little simplistic, but that was my experience as a 17-year-old. And I knew that my mother was a Christian, and I knew that other people I knew were Christian. They weren't Christian in the same way. And I had friends who were Jewish because I went to a school where there were Jewish students. And I just couldn't believe that God was rejecting people who didn't. So that's what I was talking about. And later on, as I grew older and as I came into other, other tensions like the ones you're describing, but even in those years, I mean, this was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the Episcopal Church wasn't clear, for example, on the issues of the inclusion of gay and lesbian people. And so I was part of that journey in our church. And in part, the reason it was so easy for me to believe that God embraced and accepted all was because I had this experience of such a narrow path. And I thought, you know what I mean? So my path just kept on getting broader and broader as I aged and as I understood some of the other issues in play.
But in your book, you also talk about the downsides of leaving or staying.
Of course.
What for you was the downside of leaving?
Oh, in that instance, leaving when I was at 17, it was in some ways an act of survival and of finding where I could be safe and could grow. As I indicated earlier, I lost a relationship with my younger brother. I think I hurt him deeply. And I felt the wound. I carried that guilt and that sense of loss throughout my young adult life, trying very hard to both make it up to him. And I found myself vulnerable to other situations where I would feel that same tug of guilt, and it would cause me to make promises or to extend myself in ways that I couldn't fulfill. And so, in other words, there were wounds that came with it. It wasn't a universally, here everything was, awful, and here things were great.
Right.
My life with my mom was not easy. It wasn't like just walking into some expression of the kingdom of God. It was a very gritty and messy transition. The trauma of my parents' divorce, and then all of that, it was just the mix of it. So I learned from that and from other experiences that, we do the best we can, and that there are few decisions that are without consequence, no matter how good or how right they seem to us. There are a few decisions without adverse consequences, either to ourselves on a lesser scale and certainly to others, which is humbling, I think, and a cause for appreciation of the complexity of the human experience.
Indeed. We all experience disappointments in our lives. I've certainly had my share. You talk in your book about the disappointment you had in your vocational life back in 2002 when you were in your 10th year at St. John's Episcopal Church in Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
What happened and what made you decide to stay despite that disappointment?
Oh, thank you. As you said, I had been serving in a congregation in Minneapolis, beloved congregation, for 10 years. And as my sense of vocation was emerging, I submitted my name for consideration for the cathedral position in Minneapolis, St. Mark's Cathedral. And
to be the bishop.
No, to be the dean. First the dean and then the bishop. So there were two disappointments in relatively short order. But the first one was to be the dean of the cathedral church in Minneapolis. And I tell you, Diane, if they had selected me as dean, I think I'd still be there. I was so inspired by the possibility of a position like that in a city. And you know something about our cathedral here in Washington, D.C., and it was a smaller version of that in the Twin Cities. And so I put my name in the ring, and it was a complicated process. A lot of things happened in it. And as it turned out, I came in second, which happened again a few years later when I was in the running for Bishop of Minnesota. But the disappointment in the earlier part was actually much more intense for me. I sort of spiraled down for quite some time, over a year actually, and I had all kinds of both physical symptoms and emotional disorientation that I couldn't talk about very easily with the people around me, because I was still in the church I loved and I was raising a family. But something deeply wounding had happened to my soul that I couldn't put my finger on. And what happened as a result of that, just living in that space for a year, was it from that disappointment and that pain emerged a new understanding of how my life could go forward. And it felt like a gift to me. I didn't manufacture it on my own, but I had the very clear sense that God was saying to me, why don't you just stay where you are and go as deep and as wide as you possibly can right here, and become the leader that you aspire to be, but do it here. Do it where you are. Learn all that you can. So I was given a vision. I said 5 years, so I'd been there for 10. And at that point, everyone at my church, St. John's, was expecting me to leave again. Like I had sort of publicly done this thing. It was just a matter of time before I would take another job. I was getting other invitations to apply for jobs. The bishop at the time wasn't particularly happy with me, so he would have been pleased if I had moved on. And but this other, again, that inner sense of like, what if I stayed? And not only stayed, but publicly stayed. And that was the difference. I spoke with my family and I spoke with the leaders of the church, and I said, what if I committed to you and you committed to me at another 5 years, and more perhaps, but without a doubt, I will be here for 5 more years. And once that happened, I felt free to really, again, not an easy time. It wasn't like, oh gosh, everything's great now. In fact, it was one of the hardest 5-year stretches of my life, but I felt called to be there, and also called to learn as much as I could. And so I did. And I did feel that I was preparing myself for something else. I wasn't quite sure what. The invitation to run for bishop came. I ran, thought I would be the best bishop possible in Minnesota, came in second again. Had that same sense of disorientation for a while, stayed for another year. And when the call to place my name in for Bishop of Washington came, then I knew that, first of all, my heart leapt. I was so excited.
Your husband was concerned.
He was concerned because he saw what I looked like with a broken heart, and he didn't want. And there's no guarantee. I mean, these elections are public, and they're
absolutely.
And he saw what disappointment looked like. And I said to him, look, I know, and I know what disappointment feels like, but I'd rather lose, and I'd rather try and lose than not try. And I also knew that if I was not elected, that it was time for me to leave St. John's. So that was clear. And so I had the experience, the gift of being elected in Washington in 2011. And I do remember with a vividness that is visceral, what it feels like to put your best effort out for something that you really would give your life to and be told no. And
I
I don't
must
think I get-
say
yeah.
how extraordinarily happy we've all been since you have arrived
Thank
as
you.
Bishop of the National Cathedral. You have been an inspiration to all, and I am so glad you're here with me today. I'd like to ask you, because you write about Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas and what an inspiration she has been to you. Tell us about her.
And Dr. Brown Douglas is the canon theologian for Washington National Cathedral. She is also just retired as the dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Seminary in New York, and is a womanist scholar, a theologian that writes from the perspective of women, and in particular Black women. She herself is a Black woman. And in addition to being just an extraordinary person, her writings are, her writings are so compelling. And one of the reasons why I chose to include her in the narrative, particularly in the chapter of deciding to stay, because she is one of those voices that articulates with excruciating clarity how Christianity in the United States has been built upon the pillars of white supremacy, and how, as a Black person in this country, an ancestor of slaves, that to marvel at the fact that her ancestors, her enslaved ancestors, found in the religion of their owners, the people who claimed to own them, body and soul, that they found in the message of Jesus something of liberation and promise for them, is nothing short of miraculous. And that she herself, as a woman growing up, and as it turns out, she was raised in the Episcopal Church in a Black, because we were so segregated as a church when she was growing up, that she was in a small Black church. She didn't know that there were white Episcopalians until she was in college, because everything in her world was Black, right? And she's like, when she went to this larger gathering, she's like, what are all these white people doing in my church? And to find out that we were a predominantly white church, and so unjust in our treatment of Black people and all people of color. And so I write about her because she writes honestly about the experience of being so hurt and so disillusioned by that strain of Christianity, and yet finding in the teachings of Jesus and in the examples of her ancestors a living faith that is worth giving her life to. And she, I think, as I write in the book, she writes with such searing honesty that every Black person reading this book would say, why on earth would you stay in such a prejudiced and oppressive, historically shameful institution? And her answer always is twofold. One, her own experience of the liberating power of Jesus, and the examples of her ancestors who held on to their dignity, their sense of worth, their sense of being beloved by God within, and their longing for freedom that they would never see, and that she now experiences, and that she feels responsible to carry on and to ensure that others who feel similarly put down and oppressed would find their liberation in our church. So I find her example more than inspiring, and also, for me as a white leader, counterpart to her, challenging, because she is often the one who calls me and says, Mariann, it's time. We got to say something. We've got to do something. We've got to step up. And she's right. So I'm honored and always challenged by her leadership and her witness.
The church as a whole the Episcopal Church as a part of the church as a whole has been through so much
Yes.
in the last few decades, especially in regard to allowing women to become priests, admitting gays and lesbians to the altar of Christ.
Yes.
You've been through it all. I've been through it all. I was watching as my dearest friend, Jane Dixon, went through that whole process and was there in Philadelphia when the first women were ordained. It's been a rough ride for the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you suppose it's been so difficult? I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has stayed where it is, with rules against women in the priesthood, against abortion, against homosexuality, until now, when the Pope has said gays will be welcomed at the altar. Why has it been so hard for the Episcopal Church? Is it white supremacy, white male supremacy?
You ask a very large question. I would say, in general, systemic change is hard. It's always hard. And when a series of assumptions are challenged and the way life is perceived as normative is challenged, it's always disruptive. And our sacred texts are large and complex enough that you can find justification for just about anything. And so the established order of things had its scriptural and theological foundations. And those were there, they were real, they are real. At the same time, the process of change almost always involves a few people who are given a different vision, a different understanding, a different way of seeing not only God, but themselves and the way things could be. And then how that vision is lived into reality is a process of slow gathering of momentum. And in the beginning, the resistance is always fiercer than the vision. And not every vision, of course, makes it to reality, nor should every vision, by the way. But there is something that happens with it, and it's both very spiritual, and it's also you can track it sociologically how these things happen. I would say one of the reasons it's been hard for the Episcopal Church, yes, we have been the church. It's kind of ironic that we were on the forerunner of so many of these movements, because we have been such a establishment church, the church of the ruling classes. But because we're a democratic church, and here's that we have mechanisms that could move things forward for change in such a way that the Roman Catholic Church, to use your other example, doesn't have. The Roman Catholic Church is not a democratic church, but we are. And so those people who were moving toward change, much like the people who have moved the secular world in our country toward change, they used in part the laws to help the legal processes to move these changes along, as well as civil discourse and civil disobedience. And those same things have happened in our church. And it's just, we've been among those on the issues that you've laid out. We've been among the earlier ones. That's not always been the case for us. We weren't on the forefront on the issues of race, for example. Other churches were. We aren't on the forefront when it comes to really making economic change in this country. Other churches are, but on the issues of women and on human sexuality, particularly, we were among the early ones. And the cost is always high when there is change. We might take as a contemporary example, Diane, just what it will take for us as a species and as a country and as individuals to really come to grips with climate change and what the implications are for us and the changes that we need to make. And on some level, we're at a point now in our consciousness where we know enough to know that we need to make this change, but the forces of homeostasis and resistance are strong enough that it's not a given that we will. And I would say the same was true for all of the previous struggles that you and I have been the beneficiaries of. You saw what your friend Jane Dixon, Bishop Dixon, went through. I was the next generation, so I didn't have that struggle for women, but I saw the similarities of the resistance in the movement for gay and lesbian inclusion. So it was pretty easy for me to take my place in that struggle, although I'm heterosexual, because it was in some ways the same struggle. And I pray that we can all be mindful of where we are in the arc of any movement towards positive change and do our part. And
Bishop Mariann, you are a married woman with a family.
Mm-hmm.
How difficult has that been for you, finding a way to be both a public figure and dealing with the tensions that inevitably arise within a marriage, within a family? You must travel, you must leave your family behind. There have been times in your own marriage when you wondered whether it was better to stay or to leave.
Yeah. I find, I think I would, I felt it was important to reflect on the nature of any lifelong commitment, marriage being one of them, and the seasonality of those of marriage, and what is required of us over a lifetime to sustain such commitments. And the fact that many marriages and other lifelong commitments fail in the sense that they are not preserved are not an indication of anything other. I mean, one indication is just how hard it is, how challenging it is. And I would say that I'm married to a man who is as committed to marriage as I am, and we have endured through the ups and downs of all of our life. And you're absolutely right. In the years when we were raising young children and I was working and my husband was working, obviously that required a lot of compromise and a lot of give and take. I used to joke with my Roman Catholic friends that there were times that my life made an excellent case in favor of the celibate priesthood, because there are some things about marriage that are, but that would be true of any profession, right? That would be true of any profession when trying also to raise healthy children, to which I was also committed to doing. And one of the reasons why stability matters to me is that I wanted to create a platform of emotional stability for our children and for others. I'm at, when I became of age where that was important. I write about a time when I seriously wondered whether it would be best for Paul and I to separate. And the message that I got was, my prayer was, if I was going to, I wanted real clarity, because I knew how high the stakes were all the way around. I wanted more clarity. I wanted that sense that I had been describing before. Give me that kind of clarity. And it didn't come. I didn't get it. And I decided that I wasn't going to make that kind of a seismic change, not only in our lives, but in everyone else's lives who's were in some way connected to us, if I didn't have that kind of inner clarity. And so at that, I stayed. And Paul did too. I wasn't just, it wasn't just me. And I'm glad we did. I'm so glad we did, because that crisis passed. And we have the kind of marriage that you can rely on after nearly 40 years.
I'm so glad.
Yeah, me too. As you know, I write about another very important marriage in our nation's history, that of Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. And
Indeed,
that was a marriage for the ages on every
right.
level. But my goodness, if Eleanor had decided to go when she almost did, we would be living in a very different world. And so there is something to be said for the mystery and the grace of long-term commitments.
We as a country are now facing so many challenges, one of which is hatred of the other, be it Arab and Jews being blacks or whites, being gay or straight. It feels as though there's so much hatred going on now. And I wonder, as we come toward the end of our conversation, what you might say to me and to all of us who are worried about what's happening in our country.
There's reason for worry. We would be made of stone if we didn't see and be concerned about all the things you described and more. And so one of the reasons I wanted to write the book was to say there are times when it is necessary for every one of us to dig deep and find the pillars upon which to build a life of goodness and love. To be in relationship with those who see the world differently without rancor or just to be in relationship, Diane. Part of, I think, the danger of this time is the amplification of positions from a distance, which is what social media does to us. We can disassociate almost the way bombs, drop down from, thousands of feet can cause such damage without really taking into account what's happening. I think there is a danger that we have of dehumanization through distance. And so, like so many others, I'm inspired by the people who call us to proximity with suffering, to proximity with our neighbor, to understanding the ways that others experience the world, and at the same time, holding on to what we believe to be true. Our presiding bishop often speaks of standing and kneeling at the same time. And by standing, he means holding on to the core convictions and a sense of how what we believe is right and true and just. So not backing down, if you will, when we're in the midst of struggle. At the same time, kneeling in respect, in deference to a fellow human being who has every right to be as much right to be on this planet as we do, and to care, to genuinely care about their well-being. And we live in a time where we don't know what the outcome will be. And so this is especially important for those of us who are given pillars of hope that go beyond our own, right? That we're not relying on our strength alone. We're not relying on our hope, our capacity to love alone, but that we can ask for and receive resources and gifts of grace that come from beyond us, that we can then channel and share which is, it's not the purview of religious people. We just happen to have a word or a frame of reference for it that is spiritually based, but it's a human experience. And we can all take part in that source of life and goodness for ourselves and for others.
I mean, it would seem to me that that takes a lot of bravery, if you will, to think about the other as equal in thought, belief, understanding as we ourselves are. How do you instill that bravery?
I don't know that you instill it, but I think you model it, and you try to surround yourself and others with the best of human aspirations. Our sacred traditions call us to practices of love and nurture, both for ourselves and for others, that can ground us in this work. And to never underestimate the power of just being inspired, being gifted with a way of being in the world. Now, having said all that, Diane, if we're in the midst of a political season, if we're in the midst of a time when choices have to be made, we have to step up and do what we believe and act at a time when things are going to go one way or the other, right? So this isn't a kumbaya, everyone's great kind of let's all just love and get along thing. We also have to make decisions, and we have to put ourselves out there. And I do, and I hope that others will as well. There's just a sense of humility too, and a recognition that when everything's said and done, we don't ask one another who we voted for or what our position is on this or that when we're in need of a helping hand, or when we are sharing a moment of delight, or when our hearts break at the sight of suffering. And if we can tap into that part of our humanity, maybe we have a better chance of resolving some of the issues that seem to pit us against one another.
We have an extraordinarily difficult year lying ahead.
We do.
What is your wish, your hope for the new year?
Well, I pray for us all to be surprised by the possibilities of goodness that present themselves, and the capacity for forgiveness and mercy that surface in the midst of the greatest pain, and that whatever opportunities for good that come our way, that we will take them, and to have a basic sense of possibility and hope as we move forward. And should we come across another person, or should we ourselves feel like all is lost, to look around for those sources of light and goodness that can carry us through those darker times. We don't have to do this alone. We're not alone. And our species is eminently gifted with the resources we need to overcome the challenges before us. I believe that, and I will live my life and in that hope, and pray that all will be given what we need, the strength and courage for the living of this hour.
Bishop Mariann, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you for all that you do and all that you are.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Bishop Mariann Budde. I want to let you know we'll be back with our book club in the new year on Wednesday, January 31st. I'll host a discussion of Tom Lake by Ann Patchett, followed by a conversation with Ann. I hope you'll join me then. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Allie Dickman is our events director. We couldn't have been with you today without the support of Leslie Van Sant, Kennedy Wright, Carly Cloud, Lauren Centrella, Narendra Silva, and Michelle Morgan. A big thank you to all of these people and to all of you who gathered today to be with us for this conversation. I wish you peace and joy in the new year. Blessings to all.